I'm Metal. Welcome on to episode 7 of MetalsHorrorHouse, where today we're going to make our very first miniature, D&D miniature, a creature, of course, because we love making creepy creatures and monsters here in the horror house. So for this, we're going to be using monster clay, wire, and aluminum foil, and a blowtorch to kind of craft our own little miniature here. Now, you don't have to use monster clay. You can use any type of clay you want, but monster clay for me is my personal choice. So if you're ready, let's jump right into it. Alright, my ghouly-licious peeps, you're going to want some wire here. This is just some basic wire from the dollar store. Pretty thin wire. We're going to measure it out to about 28 millimeters. We're going to double the length there, and then we're going to cut another piece the same length, and we're going to wrap that around, creating the arms and limbs. Now, don't be shy. If one side's too long, you can just use the little pliers or snippers here to kind of equal everything out. A cork comes in handy as well to hold everything in place, and it'll make things easier to when you start to add clay onto the figure. Cut up some tin foil, which we'll use to bulk out the body, make this guy pretty beefy. Now, I knew I had an idea in my head that I wanted this to be a creature of some sort, kind of like a humanoid creature. And what monster clay is really good for is to help add the clay quickly and kind of do like a sketch, as if you would do on paper if you were drawing, but you kind of sculpt quickly to build out the basic forms and see what you kind of come up with. I quickly realized that the tinfoil on the legs is not working at all, so we just ripped that right off. And we apply clay directly to the wire itself. I quickly realized that a lot of the tools I have aren't tiny enough for a lot of the miniature work, but I tend to make it work with some dab tools that I found at a weed shop. And this is just the process where you have fun with, where you start to block out things and you try and see shapes in the clay, and you just try and follow that into building up a creature or whatever you're trying to go for. Trying to put a little arch in his back, try and pop that booty out a little bit, and add in the pec muscles here, little blobs of clay for little boobs there, and the top of the rib cage that kind of wraps around the front there. And this is just really quick sketching. It's all subject to change. You know, you just want to build it up, and like I said before, kind of try and see something within the clay itself, if that makes sense. We add the little ab muscles here, molding everything together and adding in a pretty nice booty, which will be pretty plump by the end of this video. I don't know, there's just something about sculpting bums that make me laugh. Roll up a ball of clay here to place as part of the head, and I decided to mold it into the clay itself. And I was starting to think, what if this guy had no neck? What if this creature had no neck and it was just really bulky at the very top? Using a blowtorch there to kind of melt the clay so everything melds together. I warmed up my clay really soft because I wasn't liking where this was heading. I know I want this guy to be chunky, like a chunkster, a chunky creature of the night or something. So we just quickly add a bunch of monster clay to his figure, which we're going to refine later. I needed to find the center line, so I draw it right down the middle, and I was having a little issues with my cork here because it kept falling out. So with the first sketch that you see here, I had this idea of this creature with no neck. It was almost like melted into the upper traps there, and I wanted his chest to be flayed open. His bottom jaw is gone, and you just see the upper part of his teeth, and his eyes are kind of off to the side there. I liked it, but it wasn't quite what I wanted to go with. I'm using a pretty sharp tool here just to kind of make the teeth, as well as a little ballpoint tool that you use for doing nails to do the eyes. And here, I wanted this arm to be just like bulked up. Kind of think like the Tyrant from Resident Evil, where he has that one giant arm. I wanted it to maybe wrap around the body, but things just weren't working, so I ended up just cutting it down and just making this arm really long. And I decided to go with a tentacle arm. Right away, that gave me an idea that I want this creature to be sort of like a bog monster. One giant arm of tentacles off to the side, and then he has another arm that is just wrapped in tentacles that make these claws. I start to add in the rib cage here a little bit and work on his booty. And the tools that I am using are dental tools that you can find on Amazon. They're pretty cheap. They're metal, and it works really great with this clay because you can heat the tool up and you can melt parts in the clay and add detail pretty fast, almost like weld spots together with the metal tools, which is pretty neat. We add in a bit of back fat to this guy because you can't have a chunky creature without some back fat. The one side was looking a little wonky, so we just removed some of the clay there, try and make it a little more symmetrical. And at this point, I wasn't loving it. I realized that it looks better when it has a neck. So I melted the head off, got rid of the open chest idea, and started to block in the pec muscles. And I cut a hole in the stomach there, and I had this idea of tentacles spewing out from the belly, wrapping around the body itself. Tentacles, vines. I'm going to say vines since this is going to be a bog creature. Like these vines going around his body, holding this thing together, which will eventually also be holding his head here. Now, I didn't like the legs here, so I decided to cut them off and restart. I had this idea for these tentacles coming out of its stomach, wrapping around its legs to form the legs itself. We roll out 2 little noodles of clay and wrap them around both legs, forming the legs. And there we have the legs of this bog-like creature. Get some more clay noodles, and we're going to add another one from the stomach, wrapping around the left arm there, which is going to wrap all the way around, forming the claws that I'm going to add a little bit later. It's going to look like these tentacles, or I guess these vines, are holding this body together that is formed from this bog itself. Here I cut out a little square chunk of clay, measuring it for the hand, and then we start to work on the claw of this creature. Now he's going to have 3 claws that are kind of coming out, and the tentacle wrapping around, we're going to blend into the hand itself. So it looks like the tentacle from his stomach is wrapping around to create this hand and the claws itself. Now it's time for the head. I rolled a ball of clay, drew a line down the middle and then across to find the mid lines, scoop out, the eye sockets here. I started to form a skull using this little needle-like tool. Now I like the idea of this bog creature using a skull of a person who may have died in the bog itself. I thought I could add another aspect to this character's backstory, or this creature's backstory. I was going to have this long tongue kind of coming out of the bottom of the skull, which was going to be holding it up, but it just didn't look too right. So I ended up shortening the tongue here and started to add some detail to the tongue by heating up my metal tool and melting it to the underneath of the skull. The hard part here was trying to get the skull to look right at such a small scale. And I found that this little pick here did a pretty good job of getting some pretty fine detail into the skull, since, the tools that I have are a little too big. My fingers are way too big. These dental tools really came in handy. It's also a good idea to have a small piece of wire that you can put the head on, that you can sculpt it separately so you don't squish all the detail as you're moving around this small clay head of yours. Makes things a lot easier, especially when you're trying to do detail work. At this point, it still wasn't looking too right with the head, so I add another tentacle, like a neck tentacle, that would be holding this head up, almost like it's floating, and it actually looked pretty sick, so that's what we went with. Now it's time to detail this giant tentacle arm. I rolled up a bunch of little tiny clay tubes that I placed all along this arm in no order at all, just to make it look like this arm is just made up of these tentacles. I started to blend things in with the tools here. There's this dental tool that I'm using here. I believe it's for like picking your teeth. And it's a really good tool to get right in between the small creases of these little tubes and blend them all into the arm. It worked really well. You could also heat up the metal tools and just try and melt the clay and blend it in that way, but don't do that technique if you're using polymer clay. This technique only works good with oil-based clay like the monster clay I'm using, or NSP. There's this little ball stylus that I got from the beauty section of Walmart. I think it's for your nails, and we add in tiny little details all along the arms. Start to add in wrinkles to the giant belly itself, using the needle tool and a little loop tool that I made from a bobby pin. So you would make lines with a tool, then use that little bobby pin or loop tool to kind of smooth out the edges of those lines. Then hit it with the blowtorch and it creates these pretty interesting little wrinkles. I heat up the tip of one of my metal tools here and just start to add in detail around the belly to make it look a little more organic, make it look a little bit more interesting. And we use this technique all around the belly, and pretty much the rest of the body. This is a cap from, I think, a cat litter that I'm going to use for the base. And this creature started to end up looking much bigger than 28 millimeters. But I mean, it's my first miniature, and I honestly, all you can do is try your best, right? Now it's time that we move to the back. I roll up a bunch of these little tube clays that we place on the back, and these are going to kind of act like the ribs of this creature, but they're going to be vines that are holding, you know, everything together, of course. And then we use the little ball stylus to blend things together, and then we're going to hit this, of course, with the blowtorch to kind of just adhere everything, kind of weld it all together. Roll out 2 thicker pieces of tube clay, and then just add it to the legs to create the legs. And we're going to have these vines wrapping around the legs as well, which will be going into the base, which is going to be like a bog with a bunch of logs and stuff like that. And then we heat up our tool again and just start to add in detail to the legs. Then with the blowtorch to kind of smooth everything out, get rid of some fingerprints, and then blast it with some canned air upside down to cool it all off. And then to finish the belly, we add these little teeth around the little hole where the vines or tentacles are coming out of. Adds a little bit more to this sculpt. Now time to make the base out of this cat litter cap. I've never made a base before, and this is going to be my first one. And all you do is add the clay, push it down and make a flat surface, or as flat as you can make it, so it just makes it easier to work with. And then we cut off the edges so it looks a little bit cleaner. So these are going to be the logs that I'm placing here. Using our little pick tool, we're going to make these staggered lines, kind of try and make it look like wood as best we can. It's a pretty tedious process, but I feel like this is the best part when you get to really do the fine detail. Add some noodles of clay around the logs, smush it in, and it's going to look like these logs are coming out of the bog. And we do this process for every single one of these little logs. Hit it with the torch to blend everything and make the logs look a little bit more log-like. And then we start with the water. Now, I've never sculpted water either. Use your little pick to make those lines, and then you're going to go back in there with a loop tool or another tool and try and smooth out those edges as well. Here I am painting on some lighter fluid. I know that sounds weird, but this really helps smooth everything out on this monster clay and gets rid of all the fingerprints and the little stuff left behind when you rake it. And then this is the finished project. My first D&D miniature log creature. Don't have a name for him yet. If you have one, let me know. Now this turned out pretty well. I'm pretty happy with, honestly, how it looks. The hardest thing about doing this was probably the scale. It's definitely bigger than 28 millimeters. And also sculpting something at such a small scale was pretty difficult for me because I'm used to doing bigger pieces. But I had a lot of fun doing this little guy. Learned a lot. Have some ideas for some other miniatures that I might create. If you'd like to see more miniature sculptures, definitely let me know. Hit that like button so I know. And hopefully this video gave you a little bit of guidance to create your own miniature. And I'll see you in the next spooky video.